Chapter 1. The Storm Inside. Arthur was a man who lived in a world of silence. For the past 10 years, he had resided in a tiny, weathered wooden cabin right on the edge of a jagged cliff, overlooking the vast and unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. The cabin was old, its wood bleached white by the salty air and scarred by countless winter storms. Inside, there were very few things: a single iron bed, a small wooden table covered in old maps, a stone fireplace that crackled softly on cold nights, and a beautiful, silver-framed photograph of a woman with a bright, radiant smile. That woman was Eleanor, Arthur's wife, who had passed away a decade ago. Arthur had once been a man of great ambition. He was a master ship captain, known across the ports for his bravery and his ability to navigate the most dangerous waters. But when Eleanor left this world, Arthur's inner compass broke. He felt like a ship lost at sea without a lighthouse. He gave up his captain's hat, said goodbye to his crew, and retreated to this lonely cliff. He wanted to escape the world, believe it or not, because the world reminded him too much of the happiness he had lost. His days became a predictable, empty routine. He would wake up at dawn, make a hot cup of black tea, sit on his porch, and stare out at the endless horizon. He did not speak to the villagers who lived a few miles away. He became a ghost living in a wooden box, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the ocean waves against the rocks below. To Arthur, the sound of the ocean was not beautiful. It was a constant, painful reminder of the vast emptiness of his own life. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Arrival. One chilly Tuesday morning in October, everything changed. The night before had been chaotic. A massive storm had violently shaken the coast. The wind had roared like a wild beast, and the rain had beaten against Arthur's window panes so hard he thought the glass would shatter. When the sun finally broke through the grey clouds at dawn, the world was calm again, but the beach below the cliff was covered in debris from the sea, tangled seaweed, broken pieces of old wood, and smooth shells thrown up by the deep water. Arthur put on his heavy wool coat, took his walking stick, and slowly walked down the narrow, winding stone path that led to the sandy shore. He usually cleaned up the beach after storms to pass the time. As he walked along the wet sand, his eyes caught something unusual near a cluster of large black rocks. It was not a piece of wood or a bunch of seaweed. It was a shape, a human shape. Arthur's heart, which had been frozen for years, suddenly skipped a beat. He dropped his walking stick and ran as fast as his old legs could carry him. Lying face down in the wet sand was a young man, no older than 25. His clothes were torn into rags, his face was pale, and his hands were scratched and bleeding. He was completely unconscious, drenched from head to toe. Arthur knelt beside him, his hands trembling. He carefully placed 2 fingers against the young man's neck. For a long, terrifying 3 seconds, there was nothing. Then, he felt it, a faint, slow, but steady heartbeat. The boy was alive, but barely. Arthur knew he had to act fast. He could not carry the young man up the steep cliff path alone. But survival instincts he hadn't used in a decade suddenly flooded back into his brain. He managed to lift the young man onto his shoulders, using every ounce of physical strength he had left, and painfully marched up the trail back to his cabin. Chapter 3. The Broken Soul. Arthur laid the young man down on his own iron bed. He quickly built a roaring fire in the stone fireplace to warm the freezing room. He wrapped the boy in 3 thick wool blankets and carefully washed the sand and blood from his cuts. For 2 whole days, the young man remained in a deep, feverish sleep. Arthur stayed by his side the entire time, barely sleeping himself. He fed the boy warm broth using a small spoon whenever the boy groaned in his sleep. On the 3rd morning, the young man slowly opened his eyes. He stared at the wooden ceiling, confused and terrified. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his chest made him fall back onto the pillow. Arthur walked over quietly, holding a warm mug of herbal tea. "Easy there, young man," Arthur said, his voice sounding rough and deep from years of disuse. "You are safe. You are in my cabin. The storm washed you ashore, but you are going to be okay." The young man looked at Arthur, his eyes filled with immense sadness. He took a slow sip of the tea and whispered, "My name is Julian." Over the next week, as Julian's body began to heal, he slowly shared his tragic story. Julian was an artist from a busy city hundreds of miles away. He had lost his parents in a terrible accident a year ago. Grief-stricken and hopeless, he felt his life had no meaning anymore. Desperate to escape his pain, he had bought a small, cheap sailboat, intending to sail out into the ocean until he couldn't see the land anymore. He didn't care if he lived or died. When the great storm hit, his fragile boat was easily destroyed by the giant waves. "I wanted the ocean to take me," Julian said, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the fire. "I wanted it all to end. Why did you save me? Why didn't you just leave me on the sand?" Chapter 4. The Art of Healing. Arthur sat silently for a long time, listening to the crackle of the burning wood. He looked at the photograph of Eleanor on the table, and then he looked back at Julian. For 10 years, Arthur had thought he was the only person carrying such a heavy burden of sorrow. Seeing this young man, so broken and full of regret, was like looking into a mirror of his own past. "Julian," Arthur said softly, walking over to the window and looking out at the calm, blue sea. 10 years ago, my wife died. When she left, my life ended too. I built this cabin to hide from the world, hoping the silence would cure my pain. But it didn't. I realized that hiding from life doesn't stop the pain. It just freezes it. You thought the ocean would wash away your sorrow, but look at you. You survived. The sea didn't want you today, because your story isn't finished yet." Julian looked up, surprised by the old man's words. For the next month, Julian stayed at the cabin. He was too weak to travel, and Arthur secretly enjoyed the companionship he didn't know he needed. They developed a quiet, beautiful bond. Arthur taught Julian how to read the ocean waves, how to predict the weather by looking at the clouds, and how to repair old fishing nets. In return, Julian found a piece of charcoal in the fireplace and began to draw on pieces of old paper Arthur gave him. He drew the sea, the cliff, the cabin, and eventually, he drew a portrait of Arthur sitting on the porch. As Julian drew, Arthur noticed something incredible happening. The dark, heavy cloud of depression around the young man was slowly lifting. His cheeks regained their color, and he began to smile. And as Julian healed, Arthur realized that his own frozen heart was melting too. By focusing on saving another person's life, Arthur had inadvertently saved his own. He was no longer thinking about his loneliness. He was focused on helping Julian find a reason to live. Chapter 5. A New Horizon. 2 months passed, and winter was turning into spring. The cold winds replaced by a gentle, warm breeze. Julian was now fully recovered, strong, and full of life. It was time for him to return to the world he had tried to leave behind. He packed his few belongings into a small bag Arthur had given him. They stood together on the sandy beach where Arthur had found Julian 2 months ago. The ocean waves were gentle today, whispering softly against the shore. Julian turned to Arthur, his eyes shining with deep gratitude. "You gave me a second chance at life, Captain," Julian said, using Arthur's old title for the first time. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm smile that hadn't appeared on his face in a decade. He placed a strong hand on Julian's shoulder. "You don't have to repay me, Julian. Just promise me one thing. Go back to the city, paint your beautiful pictures, and live your life fully. Don't let the storms destroy your ship. Use them to become a better captain of your own destiny." Julian nodded tightly, hugged the old man, and walked away up the cliff path, turning back one last time to wave. Arthur watched him until he disappeared over the hill. Then, Arthur turned and looked at the vast ocean. For the first time in 10 years, the sound of the waves didn't feel lonely or sad. It sounded like music, a beautiful melody of hope, resilience, and new beginnings. Arthur walked back up to his cabin, opened all the windows to let the warm spring air in, and smiled at Eleanor's photograph. He was finally ready to live again.